All right, History 101 students, let's talk about ways that you can approach the readings in Chapter 3 of Worlds of History. And the readings in Chapter 3 of Worlds of History deal with issues of identity and how different societies in the ancient world chose to organize themselves. And the comparison for this chapter is looking at the way the Greeks organized themselves and the way that people in India organized themselves. And the Greeks organized themselves along the lines of something known as territorial sovereignty, and the Indians organized themselves along something known as caste. Now, keep in mind, you're not going to find that word in any of the primary sources. That was just not a word that was known to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Indians. So you're going to want to look for the evidence of that kind of identity, but don't look for your caste says or your territorial sovereignty is. Now, in terms of thinking historically, the kind of skills you should be getting out of this chapter, we are thinking about how do we read a primary source in light of a secondary source. And that's just a fancy way of saying the first source by William McNeill is a secondary source. It's written by a historian, and he's describing Greek and Indian civilization. And then all the rest of the sources are either from India or Greece. And the idea is, how do those primary sources fit into the secondary source? How would you use them? Okay, so again, the secondary source, expert testimony. The primary source, eyewitness account. Okay, so document number 1, William McNeill, giant in the field of world history. And in terms of this particular piece, this will be the easiest piece that you have to read, where he is getting into comparing how ancient Indian societies organized themselves, how ancient Greek organized societies amongst themselves. Make sure that you understand what caste is. Make sure you understand what territorial sovereignty is, because the whole point of this is that not everybody chooses to do it the same. And so here are 2 examples. And then documents 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all from India. Documents 6, 7, and 8 are all from Greece. And you're supposed to be able to find elements of how Indian people are thinking about themselves, how they relate to their world, how they organize their society in those Indian documents, and then the same thing in the Greek documents. Let me go through a couple of things. Document number 2, the Rig Veda. We're looking at some religious documents, and in fact, all of the Indian documents are religious documents. That ought to give you a clue. And we're looking at pieces from the Rig Veda in terms of the creation story. So what is their creation story? And what does that creation story have to do with caste? And then the next 2 sources, documents 3 and 4, are from the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are another set of religious literature. And document number 3 is talking about karma and reincarnation. What is karma? What is reincarnation? And how does that affect caste? How does it affect how society organizes itself? The next document from the Upanishads is getting into issues of Brahman and Atman, and these are sort of conceptual issues for the big soul and the little soul. Do not get too bogged down in the weeds on this stuff. Read through it. And in the document, you are, again, getting these ideas about what does it mean to be involved in a caste society. And then the final document is from a piece called the Bhagavad Gita. And I would like to use the whole Bhagavad Gita in this class. I will go into this in more detail. You are getting a very small selection from the most important book in terms of Indian religious literature. And the short version of the story is that there are two families that are related to each other that have gone to war over the throne. And they are lined up on the battlefield getting ready to throw down. And the god Krishna has intervened. He attempted to stop it. He attempted to mediate. He's friends with both sides of the family. He sees that the handwriting's on the wall. These people are determined to go to war. And he offers one side of the family his armies, and he offers the other side of the family his advice. So you can imagine how that goes, right? So the selection that we have is when the general of one family is riding through the middle of the battlefield surveying things. And he's looking and he's seeing all his relatives on the other side. And he doesn't want to go through with this war. And then the scene is, what's Krishna's advice? What does Krishna tell him he should be thinking about? And don't get too bogged down into the literalness of the war, right? Because on the one hand, the Bhagavad Gita is Krishna's advice to Arjuna in times of war. However, the reason people are still reading this kind of thing is because what if the war is with yourself? A war about how do you go about doing things that you really don't want to do, but you kind of have to. That's what this story is about. So take a look at that. What's it have to do with caste? Now, the next set of documents are Greek. And so document number 6 is looking at the Athenian Constitution. Don't get caught up in the weeds. Just in general, what's this Constitution kind of look like? What's its point? The next document is, in the conversation for the most famous speech ever from Thucydides, and it is a reconstruction of Pericles giving a speech about Greek loyalty to the city-state after the Peloponnesian Wars. What is he telling families just happened during the wars? What is he telling families their sons and their husbands died for? What is he telling them that has to do with the city-state and territorial sovereignty? And then finally, the last document is a piece written by Plato. We'll talk a little bit about Plato, but all of Plato's stuff is really about Socrates. And we can't tell the difference between Socrates and Plato because Socrates never wrote anything down, and everything Plato wrote was about Socrates. But in this particular case from the Republic, one of the most famous pieces of Greek philosophy, he goes into a discussion about what would an ideal state look like? How could people organize themselves in the ideal world? So I want you to be on the lookout for what does Plato says, what does Plato says, what does Plato say the ideal state would look like. And then about mid-range in that document, Plato lays out the parable of the cave, one of the most famous parables in all of philosophy. What's he saying? What's up with that parable? And what does it have to do with government and how people should organize themselves? That give you a couple of things to think about. It'll also save us 10 minutes in class. So you guys do your readings, take good notes on this stuff, and I'll see you around campus.